The air in the anchor and chain was a thick, breathing thing, a composite entity born of 100 lonely nights and 1,000 boisterous lies. It smelled of spilled beer that had soaked so deep into the wooden floorboards, it had become part of their molecular structure, a permanent ghost of fermentation. It carried the olfactory signature of frying oil that was long past its prime, the sharp, metallic tang of salt and diesel drifting in from the Norfolk docks, and the faint, ever-present humidity of the Virginia coast, a dampness that clung to skin and cloth and settled in the lungs. The lighting was a crime against optics, a collection of low-wattage bulbs shrouded in phonautical netting that cast long, predatory shadows and bathed the room in a jaundiced, nicotine-stained glow. It was a place designed for forgetting, a temporary purgatory between the unforgiving sea and the hollow demands of the shore. Sounds were layered. The low, constant hum of a failing refrigeration unit, the sharp clack of pool balls from a felt-scarred table in the back, the murmur of a dozen conversations blending into a single, indecipherable drone, and over it all, the tinny lament of a country song about a lost love and an empty bottle, pouring from a jukebox that had seen better decades. In the darkest corner of this carefully curated gloom, at a small, wobbly table whose surface was a tapestry of carved initials and cigarette burns, sat a woman. She was an anomaly, a detail that did not fit the room's coarse aesthetic. She was not large, nor loud, nor visibly weary. In fact, she was defined by an almost preternatural stillness, a lack of motion so profound it seemed to bend the room's chaotic energy around her. She wore a simple, heather-gray hooded sweatshirt, the fabric soft and worn, and dark jeans that had faded to a comfortable blue. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot at the nape of her neck, revealing a face that was plain in its symmetry, unremarkable until you noticed the eyes. They were the color of a winter sea, a flat, depthless gray that seemed to absorb the meager light without reflecting any of it back. She held a glass of water, condensation tracing clean lines down its side, but she did not drink. Her hands rested on the table, one loosely curled, the other flat, her posture relaxed yet perfectly aligned, a study in potential energy. She was a coiled spring, a sheathed weapon, but the camouflage was so perfect that to the casual observer, she was just a piece of the furniture, a woman waiting for someone who was unforgivably late. She was a ghost before her time, utterly and deliberately anonymous. Across the room, holding court in the brightest patch of the diseased light, was Petty Officer First Class Marcus Vance, a man who preferred, and loudly insisted upon, the moniker Rhino. He was the room's gravitational center, a loud, expansive man whose physical presence was a constant broadcast of his own perceived importance. He was built like a piece of deck machinery, wide, solid, and rust-proof, with a neck that seemed to start at his jaw and end at his shoulders without any intervening anatomy. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, all hard planes and a jutting chin, weathered by sun and sea spray. His voice was a booming baritone that he used like a cudgel, battering the air into submission. He was a bosun's mate, a master of ropes, anchors, and the physical, grimy work of the ship, and he carried the pride of his rate like a shield. Authority radiated from him, or rather, the performance of authority did, like heat from a furnace. He was surrounded by a small constellation of younger sailors, seamen and petty officers third class, who orbited him with a mixture of awe and fear, laughing too loudly at his jokes and nodding too vigorously at his pronouncements. He was their king, and this bar, the anchor and chain, was his crumbling, sticky-floored castle. Rhino's gaze, sweeping his domain with proprietary arrogance, snagged on the corner table, snagged on the woman. He watched her for a full minute, his brow furrowing. She did not belong. Everything about her was wrong. She was quiet in a loud place, still in a restless one, sober in a drunken one. She was an error in the code of his world. His mind, a simple and direct instrument, processed this discrepancy through the only filters it possessed, prejudice and ego. She was a civilian, clearly, probably some officer's neglected wife or worse, a tourist who'd taken a very wrong turn off the main drag. She was an intrusion, a foreign body that the system of his universe needed to expel. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his lips. It was the smile of a predator who has mistaken a sleeping tiger for a stray cat. He saw an opportunity not just for sport, but for instruction. He would demonstrate to his young acolytes how the world worked, how insiders dealt with outsiders. He pushed himself back from his table, the chair groaning in protest. "All right, boys, watch this," he announced, his voice slicing through the general din. "Gonna go make our little guest feel a little less welcome." His crew snickered, their faces a mixture of sycophantic glee and nervous anticipation. They knew Rhino's temper and they knew his shows. He ambled across the room, his heavy boots thudding against the worn floorboards with deliberate weight. He was a ship cutting through a calm sea, and the other patrons, sensing the shift in the room's pressure, parted before him. He came to a stop before her table, planting his large hands on its surface and leaning forward, casting her in his considerable shadow. The smell of cheap beer and self-satisfaction washed over her. "You lost, sweetheart?" he began, his voice a low rumble of condescending chumminess. The woman did not look up immediately. She continued to stare at a point somewhere in the middle distance, as if he were nothing more than a temporary obstruction of her view. After a beat of silence that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, she slowly raised her eyes to his. They were flat, analytical, and utterly devoid of fear, or indeed, any emotion at all. It was like being looked at by a machine. "No," she said. Her voice was calm, low, and even. A single, perfectly formed word. "No explanation. No deference. No fear." The simple, unadorned denial threw Rhino off balance. He had expected stammering, or a flustered explanation, or an indignant retort. He had expected a reaction, an emotional foothold he could exploit. This placid negation gave him nothing to work with. It was like punching water. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place, wider and more menacing this time. His audience was watching. "No? See, I think you are," he pressed, leaning closer. "This is a Navy bar. A place for people who work for a living. People who serve. We don't get a lot of tourists in here. So why don't you finish your water and go find a place that serves those little umbrellas in their drinks?" The men behind him chuckled their approval. It was a classic Rhino performance. Dominant, dismissive, and public. The woman's expression did not change. Her gaze remained locked on his, unwavering. She seemed to be looking straight through his performance, past the bluster and the swagger, and into the soft, insecure machinery whirring away behind his eyes. It was a deeply unnerving experience. He felt less like a man confronting a woman and more like a specimen being observed under a microscope. "I'm fine right here," she stated. It was not a request, nor was it a debate. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same finality as a captain giving a course correction. This was not going according to the script. Her calm was a defiance far more potent than any shouted insult could have been. It was a quiet, unassailable fortress of self-possession, and his ego was beginning to crack against its walls. He was a man who understood force, volume, and emotional leverage. He did not understand this. This silent, placid refusal to be intimidated was a foreign language, and it infuriated him. He needed to escalate, to force a reaction, to prove that his power was real. With a swift, deliberately clumsy movement, he swiped his hand across the table, knocking over her glass. Water splashed across the dark wood and dripped onto the floor. "Oops," he said, the word dripping with mock sincerity. "Clumsy me." The bar grew quieter. The audience was no longer just his small circle of admirers. Others were watching now, sensing the curdling of the atmosphere. This had crossed a line from casual hazing into something uglier. The woman did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not even look at the spilled water. Her eyes remained on his, and for the first time, a flicker of something registered in their depths. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was a cold, clinical assessment. It was the look a bomb disposal expert gives a complex device just before deciding which wire to cut. She was analyzing him, weighing his actions, calculating variables he couldn't even perceive. To the omniscient observer, it was the look of a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, curious to see just how stupid the creature truly was. Slowly, with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic, she reached down, picked up the empty glass from the floor, and placed it back on the table with a soft, definitive click. She then folded her hands in her lap. She did not say a word. The silence was his answer. It was a roaring, deafening silence that screamed his irrelevance. He had thrown his best punch and she hadn't even blinked. Now he was exposed, his bluff called in front of his court. Rage, hot and blinding, flooded his senses. It was the rage of impotence. He had to make her react. He had to break that dam of composure. He leaned in until his face was inches from hers, his voice dropping to a gravelly, threatening whisper. "You think you're tough? You think you can just sit there and disrespect me in my own house?" He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the soft fabric of her sweatshirt. "I think you need to learn some manners." The physical contact was a catastrophic miscalculation. The moment his fingers closed around her bicep, the air temperature in their immediate vicinity seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Still, she did not struggle. She did not even tense. She simply looked down at his hand on her arm, and then back up to his face. And she spoke, her voice still impossibly calm, but now laced with something hard and sharp as diamond. "Take your hand off me," she said. It was the last sane advice Marcus Rhino Vance would receive that evening. It was a final opportunity to walk away. He, of course, did not take it. But before he could utter the next boastful threat, before he could tighten his grip and escalate his fatal error, the world outside the bar's grimy windows decided to intervene. It began with a low moan, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The moan grew into a shriek, the cry of a vengeful god. The rain, which had been a steady drizzle, suddenly became a horizontal fusillade, hammering against the building like a million tiny fists. The lights flickered once, twice, and then, with a collective groan from the bar's ancient wiring, they died, plunging the room into absolute, disorienting darkness. Panic was immediate, a collective gasp, followed by a chorus of curses and nervous shouts. The jukebox sputtered into silence. The only light came from the weak, flickering glow of a few cell phone screens, casting monstrous, dancing shadows on the walls. The roar of the wind was now a physical presence, a concussive force that made the entire building shudder. This was no ordinary squall. This was a hurricane making landfall with a speed and ferocity that had defied all forecasts. Through the chaos, another sound emerged, thin and desperate. It was the crackle of a marine band radio behind the bar, a piece of equipment that was usually just part of the decor. A voice, distorted by static and terror, sliced through the air. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Ferry Vessel Star of the Chesapeake. We have lost all power. Repeat, total power failure. We are adrift, taking on water, being pushed onto the Thimble Shoal breakwater. 23 souls on board. Mayday." The message repeated, each word a spike of ice water in the gut. A civilian ferry, caught in the storm's teeth, was about to be smashed to pieces against the rocks. 23 people were about to die. The sailors in the bar, men trained for crisis, reacted with a flurry of useless activity. Shouts of, "Someone call the Coast Guard," were met with replies of, "No signal." Rhino, his pathetic confrontation with the woman completely forgotten, was bellowing orders into the darkness, his voice thick with an authority he no longer possessed. "Someone get a flashlight. Find the circuit breaker. Jackson, call the base operator. Tell them what's happening." His commands were loud, but they were hollow, a frantic attempt to impose order on a situation that was spiraling far beyond his control or comprehension. He was following a checklist in his head, a peacetime protocol for a wartime reality. He was a creature of the known, and the unknown had just swallowed him whole. His bravado was revealed for what it was, a thin veneer over a core of profound incompetence in the face of true chaos. In the absolute darkness, in the frozen moment of panic after the lights had died, Rhino's hand was still on the woman's arm. But it was no longer a gesture of aggression. It was now the desperate grip of a drowning man. And then he felt it. For the first time, she moved. It was not a struggle or a flinch. It was a shift, a realignment of her entire being. Her arm, which had been soft and yielding, became a bar of solid steel beneath his fingers. With a movement so smooth and precise it felt less like human motion and more like a piston engaging, she peeled his fingers from her bicep, breaking his grip with effortless, almost contemptuous ease. He felt a brief, shocking flare of pain in his wrist as she applied a subtle, expert pressure to a nerve cluster he never knew existed. His hand fell away, numb and tingling. Then she was gone. She did not rise from her chair so much as flow out of it, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. While others fumbled for their phones or shouted into the void, she moved through the pitch-black room with the silent, unerring confidence of a nocturnal predator. There was no hesitation, no stumbling. Her movements were fluid, economical, and terrifyingly purposeful. It was as if the darkness was her natural element, a medium she understood intimately. She moved not towards the door, but towards the source of the desperate mayday call, a ghost navigating a landscape of frozen, panicked bodies. She reached the bar in 3 seconds. Her hands swept across its cluttered surface, not randomly, but with the focused precision of a surgeon. She located the radio, her fingers dancing over the controls, adjusting the squelch and tuning the frequency with an innate familiarity that was utterly baffling. She bypassed the handset, finding a secondary input jack and retrieving a small, coiled earpiece and microphone from a pocket inside her sweatshirt. In the space of 10 seconds, she had established a secure, private communication line while the rest of the room was still blinking away the afterimage of the dead lights. Her voice cut through the darkness, and it was a different voice. The quiet, calm tone was gone, replaced by something else entirely. It was a voice stripped of all emotion, all pleasantry, all humanity. It was the voice of pure, unadulterated command. It was a weapon. Port com. Port com. This is an undeclared station. How do you copy? Her words were clipped, precise, a string of technical jargon that silenced the amateurs. The radio crackled back a frantic, confused response. She did not wait for them to understand. I have a mayday relay from ferry vessel Star of the Chesapeake. Position approximate 1 nautical mile east of Thimble Shoal Light. Vessel is dead in the water 23 POB, taking on water, being set onto the breakwater by wind force 9, gusting 10. Your current SAR assets are out of position. You need to dispatch all available tugs from the commercial pier immediately. Priority Alpha. Acknowledge. Silence from the radio. Then, a hesitant voice. Ma'am, who is this? We don't have an undeclared station in that sector. You have a catastrophic failure of imagination. She snapped back, her voice like the crack of a whip. Designate this station Sea Dragon. Now, I am assuming tactical control of this incident. Divert the Hampton Roads and the Dominion to intercept coordinates I am about to transmit. They have the bollard pull to hold the ferry off the rocks. Scramble your rescue helos for evac, but they won't be able to get close in this crosswind. This is a salvage and containment op first, rescue second. Do you copy? Portcom? The term Sea Dragon hung in the air, a code word of immense but unknown significance. The authority in her voice was absolute, undeniable. It was the authority of someone who had lived their entire life in the center of the storm, for whom this chaos was just another Tuesday. She turned from the radio, a silhouette against the storm-lit windows. She was no longer a woman in a gray hoodie. She had become something else, a nexus of command and control. Her eyes, now accustomed to the dark, swept the room. She was not seeing panicked sailors. She was seeing assets, resources, tools to be deployed. You! She barked, her voice hitting Rhino in the chest like a physical blow. He was standing, dumbfounded, a few feet away. You're a bosun's mate. You know knots and lines. Get to Pier 7. There are 3 Triton-class tugs moored there. I need their engines spooled and ready for sea in 5 minutes. Take him and him." She pointed at 2 of Rhino's young followers, who were frozen in a state of slack-jawed awe. "Move!" They did not question her. They did not hesitate. The sheer, overwhelming force of her competence short-circuited their ability to think, leaving only the imperative to obey. They scrambled for the door as if propelled by an invisible force. "You!" She pointed to another sailor, a young man with an engineering rate patch on his uniform. "Find the backup generator for the pier. It's a 500-kilowatt diesel unit behind the cold storage warehouse. Get it online. We need the pier lights and the capstans functional yesterday. Go!" He too vanished into the storm. One by one, she dissected the chaos and assigned the pieces to the stunned men in the room. She gave orders that were complex, specific, and displayed a terrifyingly intimate knowledge of the naval base's infrastructure, the storm's meteorological dynamics, and the precise capabilities of every piece of equipment she mentioned. She was a grandmaster, seeing the entire board while everyone else was still trying to figure out how the pawns moved. She orchestrated a symphony of response from the wreckage of their panic, her voice the conductor's baton, turning a disorganized rabble into a focused, effective rescue force. The onlookers, the chorus of stunned sailors, could only watch, their minds struggling to reconcile the quiet, unassuming woman from the corner table with the tactical whirlwind that now commanded them. They were witnessing a masterclass in crisis management, a demonstration of skill so profound it bordered on the supernatural. The back door of the bar slammed open, admitting a howling gust of wind and rain, and a figure silhouetted against the emergency lights of a nearby building. The man was tall and lean, his uniform crisp despite the weather, his salt and pepper hair cut regulation short. On his collar were the 3 silver chevrons and star of a Master Chief Petty Officer. But it was the anchor on his rating badge, fouled with a star, that marked him as something more, the Master Chief Petty Officer of the command. He was David Sterling, a living legend in the enlisted ranks, a man whose quiet authority was second only to the base commander himself. He had been drawn by the same radio call, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. He strode into the room, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in the organized chaos. His gaze swept past the panicked civilians, past the sailors moving with newfound purpose, and then it found her. She was standing by the bar, one hand on the radio, the other gesturing towards a schematic of the harbor she had somehow found and spread across the bar top, illuminated by a single cell phone. Master Chief Sterling stopped dead. His back, already straight, went ramrod stiff. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in dawning, profound recognition. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as this titan of the enlisted fleet stared at the unassuming woman in the gray hoodie. He took 3 more steps forward, his boots clicking sharply on the floor. He came to a halt exactly 3 feet in front of her, his body snapping into the most rigid, formal position of attention he had executed in 20 years. It was a gesture of respect so deep, so absolute, it was almost an act of worship. "Commander Thorne!" he barked, his voice a thunderclap that cut through the roar of the storm. "Master Chief Sterling reporting as ordered. The base emergency response team is 5 minutes out. What are your instructions, ma'am?" The name descended into the room like a physical weight. Commander. The title landed first, a shockwave of cognitive dissonance. But it was the name that followed, Thorne, that acted as the detonator. For in the closed, rumor-filled world of naval special warfare, the name Thorne was not a name. It was a myth, a ghost story operators told each other in hushed, reverent tones. Commander Evelyn Thorne. Call sign, Wraith. The first woman to complete SEAL training, a fact so deeply classified it was officially denied. The architect of a dozen operations that were nothing more than whispers in the intelligence community. The commanding officer of a special mission unit so secret that it did not technically exist. She was a legend hiding in plain sight, a creature of the shadows who had, for a single terrifying moment, stepped into the light. A collective, silent understanding rippled through the room. Every sailor, Every man who had watched the confrontation suddenly felt a cold dread snake its way up their spine. They hadn't just witnessed a barroom bully hassling a woman. They had witnessed a child throwing rocks at a nuclear submarine. And in the doorway, soaked to the bone, having just returned from his task, stood Rhino. His face, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The world had not just shifted on its axis. His entire universe had just been obliterated. He was staring at the quiet woman from the corner, but he was seeing the face of his own professional and personal extinction. He understood, with a clarity that was both blinding and soul-crushing, the catastrophic scale of his mistake. The crisis under her command was averted. The tugs, manned by the now terrified sailors from the bar, reached the ferry in the nick of time. They secured lines and, in a brutal, hour-long battle against the storm, managed to hold the vessel off the breakwater until the winds subsided enough for it to be towed to safety. All 23 souls were saved. Through it all, Commander Thorne's voice remained on the radio, a calm, precise instrument of control, directing the complex ballet of steel and water with inhuman composure. When it was over, when the last report was filed and the emergency crews had taken over, a strange quiet settled back over the anchor and chain. The power was back on, its harsh fluorescent glare revealing the puddles of water and the pale, shaken faces of the men who remained. They stood in small, silent groups, avoiding eye contact with the woman who now sat back at her corner table, nursing a fresh glass of water as if nothing had happened. Then, she looked up, her wintersea eyes finding Rhino where he stood, frozen, near the door. She beckoned him with a single, slight motion of her finger. Every man in the room felt a sympathetic jolt of terror. Walking across the floor towards her table was the longest and most difficult journey of Marcus Vance's life. Each step was a step toward his own execution. He stood before her, head bowed, unable to meet her gaze, a humble giant waiting for the axe to fall. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were quiet, clinical, and they cut him to the bone. "Petty Officer Vance," she began, the formal address a weapon in itself. "You made a series of tactical errors this evening. Your first was a failure of intelligence. You saw a person in civilian clothes and made an assumption based on gender and demeanor. You failed to gather data. You failed to observe. Your second error was a failure of threat assessment. You initiated a confrontation without understanding the capabilities of your adversary. This is how small teams get wiped out in the field." She paused, letting the words sink in. This wasn't a dressing down. It was a debrief, a brutally honest after-action report on his own character. "Your most critical failure, however," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "was a failure of imagination. You could not conceive of a reality that existed outside your own limited experience. You believe strength is loud. You believe authority has to be announced. You believe competence is predicated on a person looking and acting exactly like you. This cognitive rigidity, petty officer, is not just a personal failing. It is a tactical liability. It makes you a danger to any sailor who has the misfortune of serving under your command." Rhino finally looked up, his face ashen. He opened his mouth to apologize, to beg, to explain, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "There will be no disciplinary review," she said, and for a moment, a wild, impossible hope flared in his chest. It was immediately extinguished. A formal punishment would be insufficient. It would teach you only to fear consequences, not to understand your failure. Your education requires a more direct approach. She took a small sip of water. "I have just spoken with Master Chief Sterling. As of 0800 tomorrow, you are reassigned. Your new duty station will be my personal administrative staff. You will be my aide." The sentence was so much worse than a court-martial. It was a sentence of prolonged, daily, inescapable humiliation. He, Rhino, the king of the deck plates, would be fetching her coffee. He would be managing her schedule. He would be filing her paperwork. He would be forced, for the next 2 years, to exist in the shadow of her quiet, relentless, superhuman competence. He would be a constant, living witness to the very thing he had so arrogantly dismissed. It was not a punishment. It was a forced recalibration of his entire soul. The story of that night in the Anchor and Chain passed into the annals of naval lore. It became a modern fable, a teaching tool whispered in chiefs' messes and recounted by instructors at Annapolis. The details grew with each telling. The storm became a Category 5 hurricane. The ferry became a fully loaded cruise ship, and Commander Thorne was said to have calmed the seas with a single stern glare. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. It was a lesson, burned into the institutional memory of the Navy, about the profound danger of making assumptions. Years passed. On a crisp autumn day at Naval Training Center Great Lakes, a group of new Chief Petty Officer selectees were gathered for a leadership seminar. Their instructor was a man they all respected, a senior chief boatswain's mate named Marcus Vance. He was not the man he had once been. The boisterous arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful gravity. The swagger had been replaced by a steady, confident bearing. He was known as one of the best mentors in the fleet, a man with a unique and powerful perspective on the nature of true leadership. He stood before the class, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm going to tell you a story," he began, his voice calm and even. "A story about the most profound professional failure of my life. It happened in a dirty little bar in Norfolk. And it started because I saw a woman sitting alone, and I decided I knew exactly who and what she was." He told them the entire story, leaving out no detail of his own foolishness, his own hubris, his own catastrophic failure. He did not spare himself. He painted himself as the villain, the fool, the cautionary tale. He used his own humiliation as his greatest teaching aid. When he was finished, the room was silent, the young chiefs looking at him with a new level of understanding and respect. "Your collar anchors," he said, tapping his own. "They don't make you a leader, they just make you responsible. Your voice doesn't give you authority, your actions do. And the most dangerous person on any battlefield is the one you underestimate. They are the quiet professional, the one in the corner watching, listening, thinking. They are not impressed by your noise. They are not swayed by your ego. Their strength isn't in what they say, it's in what they do. Your job as leaders is not to be the loudest person in the room. It's to be the one who is wise enough to recognize true strength when you see it, no matter what uniform it's wearing or not wearing. This, then, is the enduring lesson. It is a moral that transcends the specific confines of a military context and speaks to a universal truth. True strength does not need to announce itself. True competence is its own argument. Authority that must be proclaimed is no authority at all. The loudest voice in the room is often the most insecure, a desperate broadcast meant to conceal a hollow core. Real power, real influence, resides in quiet mastery, in the disciplined application of skill, in the calm at the center of the storm. It is a force that is felt, not heard. It is the lesson taught by the unassuming woman in the gray hoodie, a lesson that reminds us to look past the surface, to discard our prejudices, and to hold a deep and abiding respect for the quiet ones. For in the silent spaces, in the calm observers, often lies a depth of skill and a strength of character that could, if roused, command the seas themselves. Do not judge a book by its cover, for you may find yourself facing a legend, and you will not be prepared for the reckoning that follows.